Imagine this. You're walking home, maybe through the quiet Italian countryside, just before dawn. It's misty, cool. And then you see something. Something you just cannot explain. A strange light, maybe, through the trees. Or a shape coming down that's unlike anything you know. Maybe even figures stepping out onto the path right in front of you.
Yeah, it's a powerful image.
Well, for some people in Italy, between 1912 and that really intense period in 1954, this wasn't just imagination. According to the reports anyway, this was something they actually experienced.
That's what the historical record claims, at least in some cases.
Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we are absolutely plunging into a fascinating, sometimes really bizarre, and honestly quite perplexing collection of historical sources.
We really are.
We're tackling alleged UFO landings, close encounters, reported across Italy from 1912 right up to that major wave in 1954.
And our source material for this is pretty substantial. It's a comprehensive technical report that meticulously documents and, importantly, analyzes these early cases.
Right. And it pulls from all sorts of places, doesn't it? Like decades-old newspaper clippings, obscure UFO journals, private reports.
Exactly. A real treasure trove, or maybe a minefield, of historical accounts.
So our goal today, our mission with you, the listener, is to really unpack all this material. We want to dig into it case by case, pull out the key insights.
And understand the nature and, crucially, the reliability of these reports, or, as we'll definitely see, often the unreliability.
Yeah, that seems like a big theme.
It is. What do these accounts tell us? Not just about maybe strange objects, but about, human perception, mystery, and the specific cultural moment these stories emerged from.
Absolutely. And we need to set the stage because this was a very different world back then.
Oh, definitely.
We're talking pre-widespread television, newspapers, magazines, the cinema. These were huge. They didn't just report news. They really shaped how people saw the world, their imagination.
Hugely influential. So when something totally new and like flying saucers bursts onto the scene,
these media outlets become the main way those ideas spread, and maybe even how people interpreted what they thought they saw.
That's a key point the report makes. It's like a time capsule, really. It shows how these extraordinary claims were reported, how they got filtered, sensationalized, maybe distorted.
Even before the internet age, media was playing this massive role in creating a kind of shared story, maybe even a folklore around these events.
That's exactly it, a shared narrative.
Okay, so let's start at the beginning. The report goes way back, even before flying saucers was a common term. What do these earliest glimpses look like?
Well, the source material includes cases from the early 20th century, and these reports often feel almost, folkloric. They're usually very sparse on detail.
And reported much later, right?
Critically, yes.
Yeah.
Often decades after the supposed event. And that time lag right from the start creates huge problems for verification, scientifically or historically.
Okay, so give us an example. What's one of the earliest documented cases in this report?
Let's start with case 1201, dated 1912. Now, the report is clear. This isn't a solid investigation file. It's basically a rumor collected by a UFO enthusiast many, many decades later.
Okay, and the story.
It involves a man who supposedly saw a sphere, heard a strange noise, and then felt this forceful slap to his face, knocked him right down.
A slap from a sphere.
Yeah, and the really bizarre part, he later claimed he noticed an imprint on his cheek that looked like a skeleton's hand.
Whoa. Okay, a skeleton's hand imprint from a UFO in 1912. That's visually striking, but sounds, physically improbable.
It does, and the report's analysis is crucial here. The author notes the source is incredibly thin, third-hand info collected super late based on unverified rumor.
Right.
They also point out that, at the time, any local beliefs about circular objects related more to, wandering spirits or folklore. The connection to a structured craft, a physical thing, was probably non-existent in the original context.
So it might have been interpreted very differently back then.
Exactly. The report uses a classification, INS-UNR, meaning the source info itself is considered incredibly unreliable or unsubstantiated.
Okay, so right off the bat, we're seeing a pattern. Late reports, maybe filtered through folklore or personal beliefs, or even influenced by later UFO stories people heard.
Precisely. Which leads us to Case 2301 from 1923. This one mentions a mysterious female being.
Another early, almost mythical sounding one.
Also seemingly from a folkloric source. Reported by a young girl, it centers on this encounter with a, quote, mysterious female being. The narrative, as it was recounted much later, has really strong religious themes woven through it.
How so?
Well, the girl reportedly saw a statue of the Virgin Mary later that same day, and she felt the statue was dressed similarly to the being she'd encountered.
Ah, okay, so a direct link to her religious context.
Yes. The report highlights these religious overtones and suggests the experience could easily be a subjective religious vision or maybe a fantasy, especially for a young girl in a very devout rural setting where visions might be, a way to understand unusual things.
So again, the interpretation seems heavily shaped by the witness's personal world and beliefs.
Absolutely. And like the 1912 case, the data quality is just poor. No contemporary records, only later accounts, huge time gap. The report concludes it's impossible to evaluate meaningfully as an external event. Highly unreliable. Tells us more about the witness's inner world, perhaps, than anything else.
Then we jump to 1930. Cases 3001 and 3002 involving elderly peasant women. Same pattern. Late reporting, unreliability.
Largely, yes. Similar challenges. Case 3001 near Biziun. An old woman sees an object descend, unusual beings get out, but the report comes from a researcher recalling what she told him over 50 years later.
50 years, wow. Memory alone makes that questionable.
Extremely questionable. And the report points out something really interesting. Details in this 50-year-old memory bear a striking resemblance to the Sinina case.
The famous one from 1954.
Exactly, which hadn't happened yet when the 1930 event supposedly occurred, but was very famous by the time the researcher recorded the memory.
Ah, so this is where that idea of narrative contagion might come in. Details from later, famous cases, maybe bleeding into the memory of an earlier, fuzzier event.
That's precisely what the report suggests is possible, that the memory got distorted or, embellished, reinterpreted through the lens of later well-known stories like Sinina. Reliability. Rated low, possibly just hearsay. Researchers actually went to the area 50 years later, found no one else who remembered anything like it. One local even thought it was probably a hoax.
And case 3002.
Also 1930, near Castelnuovo Baradenga, peasant woman sees a red object, small men in white overalls. This report comes via her son, 43 years after the event, relaying his mother's memory to a UFO group.
So again, a big delay, third-hand account.
Exactly. Relying on someone else relaying a memory that's likely decayed or maybe got contaminated over time. No independent corroboration. Both 1930 cases are rated as having unreliable sources for these reasons.
The picture for these very early cases is becoming crystal clear then. Reports emerging decades later, often single witness or hearsay, may be mixed with local beliefs, religion, folklore.
And critically lacking any solid verifiable evidence. Physical traces, other witnesses confirming the core event, it's just not there.
Which makes them almost impossible to treat as reliable data points for, actual landings or encounters. They tell us about memory, culture, belief.
But very little objectively about what might have physically happened, if anything. That's the challenge. It highlights how hard historical research into these things is. You're not just finding a story, you're sifting through layers of memory, potential invention, belief systems.
How stories just get told and retold and change over time.
Exactly. And understanding those pitfalls is vital before we even get to the main event, the big wave.
Right, which is where we're heading now, 1954, the absolute peak of Italian saucer fever.
That's the term, yeah. The autumn of 1954 saw this explosion of reports, sightings, alleged landings, not just Italy, but France too, parts of Europe. It was a genuine wave like nothing Italy had seen before in terms of intensity and public awareness.
And the source material is very clear. The media wasn't just watching this happen. They were a huge part of it.
Oh, a massive role. Crucial. Newspapers, magazines. They weren't passive observers. They were actively hunting for stories, often sensationalizing them. They became the main way these ideas spread, shaping how the public saw it all and really fueling the saucer fever.
So a dramatic story from one town could appear in print.
And then someone in another town reads it, sees something ambiguous in the sky, and maybe their interpretation or even their description gets influenced by that story they just read.
It creates this feedback loop.
Powerful feedback loop, exactly. And this Italian wave wasn't happening in a vacuum. It was influenced by reports from outside Italy that had seeped into public awareness.
Like Kenneth Arnold's sighting in the U.S. back in '47.
That's one key precursor, yes. Also the ongoing sightings in France at the time. And maybe most importantly, the accounts of George Adamski.
Adamski, the contactee, claiming chats with Venusians.
That's the one. His stories were incredibly popular, widely publicized, including in Italy. And he provided very specific descriptions, the classic saucer shape, those spherical landing gear things, the look of the occupants.
Which could easily give people a kind of template, right? A ready-made image to map onto strange lights or experiences.
Precisely.
Well,
It provided a framework, whether for genuine misinterpretation or, as the report heavily implies in some cases, for deliberate fabrication. The media environment in '54 was just perfectly primed for this kind of cultural contagion, popular images and tropes spreading like wildfire.
and speaking of fabrication, the report doesn't shy away from identifying outright hoaxes from this period.
Not at all. It meticulously documents several cases that are definitively or almost certainly hoaxes.
Let's get into those. Where does the report start unraveling these stories?
A really famous one, though it happened a bit before the '54 peak, is Case 5208, the Shearsing Glacier photos from 1952.
Right, those photos were pretty widely circulated, weren't they?
Yes.
As solid evidence.
They were. The witness, Giancarlo Manguzzi, claimed he'd photographed this classic flying saucer disc on a glacier, even with a little figure nearby. Looked convincing.
That?
But Manguzzi himself confessed. Before the story and photos were even published in a major magazine, Epoca, which was planning a big feature, he admitted he faked the whole thing.
He admitted it. Why?
Explicitly to try and break into journalism, he wanted attention, a way in.
Wow. Okay, that's definitive. Did he explain how he faked it?
Yes. He orchestrated it with another man, Antonio Sprecapane. And Sprecapane actually built a miniature set for the photos.
A miniature set? So it wasn't even like a distant shot of something ambiguous. It was a model.
Correct. A staged miniature scene. Sprecapane confirmed his role later, the really wild part. Despite Manguzzi confessing before publication, the magazine reportedly still paid him for the story and photos.
That's incredible. What about Sprecapane's later claims? CIA interviews and things.
Yeah, Sprecapane later added these other stories being interviewed by intelligence agencies, a fake conference. The report dismisses these as likely further embellishments or fabrications on his part, maybe trying to cash in on the hoax's notoriety himself.
So the final assessment on Shearsing.
Classic, well-documented photo hoax. Perfectly reflects the cultural mood, the desire to believe, and maybe the desire to exploit that belief.
A really stark reminder about photographic evidence.
Mm-hmm.
What about Case 5449 from Trudeau in 1954? That sounds like a group effort.
Oh, it absolutely was. A fully orchestrated prank involving, get this, 19 men in the town of Trudeau.
19 people.
Yeah. The main witness, a local farmer they called Gudola, was actually one of the ringleaders, and their props were incredibly basic. A big white cotton sheet cut into a circle.
Seriously.
Yep. Sheets of tinfoil stuck to it, car headlights behind it to make it glow, and the aliens, just two kids wearing plastic helmets.
So they literally staged a fake landing in a field.
Near the local sports stadium. Yeah. Guidola's part was key. He had to burst into the local bar, all dramatic, shouting he'd seen Martians land.
To draw a crowd.
Exactly. Get everyone talking, maybe fool some people, but specifically to hook one particular person.
And who was the target?
A local guy, Gianfranco Tonali. He was a correspondent for an evening paper, but unemployed, really desperate for a full-time journalism gig.
Ah, I see where this is going.
The pranksters played him perfectly, fed him the whole fabricated story, saucer taking off, the works. Tonali, seeing his big break, filed the story without checking it properly.
And it blew up.
Totally. National news, other journalists descending on Trudeau, newsreels, even rumors of TV crews. All from a simple prank exploiting the saucer fever and one guy's desperation.
What happened to the hoaxers?
The local carabinieri, the police, investigated. They figured out who was involved, filed an official report. Legal action was apparently started against the pranksters and Tonali for spreading false info.
So a real cautionary tale about media and hoaxes working together.
A perfect example, yeah. Shows how easily the fascination could be manipulated.
Any other confessed hoaxes the report highlights?
Yes. Case 5447 from Cremona, also 1954. Two guys, Pericles and Piero Alberini, just admitted they made it up as a joke during the peak of the craze, explicitly said they were inspired by all the stories they were reading in the papers.
So some were elaborate productions, some just simple jokes riding the wave?
Right. And then there's Case 5461 from Naples, 1954. This one's assessed as a probable hoax. The account came from Vincenzo Datillo, a lawyer and journalist.
Okay, what did he claim?
Saw a star-like object land. A small humanoid in a transparent suit gets out. And here's the kicker. They supposedly talked in Old Latin.
Old Latin with an alien. Okay, my skeptical arms are ringing loudly now. That sounds like fictional.
That's exactly how the report assesses it. The old Latin detail is just so bizarre, and the themes discussed advanced science, needing lightweight pilots fit perfectly with the contactee narratives popular at the time.
Like Adamski's stories.
Precisely. The author sees it as a symbolic, likely invented episode, maybe blending utopian science ideas, religious echoes, Latin being the church language, and classical imagery that an educated Italian like Dattalo would know.
Did Dattalo ever clarify?
Significantly, yes. He later described the experience himself not as literal fact, but as a supernatural clairvoyant phase, or even an anticipatory fantasy. So, his own later framing pushes it away from a real event, rated probable hoax.
Less a report, more like allegorical fiction passed off as real initially.
That's a good way to put it. The report also mentions Case 5303 from Valelia, 1953, classified as CE4, which often means interaction or contact. This one had a long delay before reporting, religious influence also assessed as a probable hoax.
And Case 5439 from Terli, 1954, pear-shaped heads and TV appearances.
Yeah, an office worker supposedly met glowing beings with pear-shaped heads. They spoke perfect Italian and, incredibly, asked if he'd be willing to appear on television.
Okay, again, sounds straight out of pulp sci-fi.
Fits the contactee template perfectly. And crucially, the report notes, the supposed witness never reported this himself to anyone official. The story only came out years later via a confidant, someone already deep into UFOs and the occult.
Ah, so the source is a believer relaying a secondhand story.
Very likely. Suggests it was either invented by the confidant or maybe a fantasy the witness shared that the confidant took literally. Rated likely hoax, amplified through a believer's filter.
And finally, you mentioned one link to selling something.
Right. Case 5463 from Florence, 1954, briefly mentioned as a known promotional hoax for a shoe or sock company, just trying to get free publicity during the craze.
Selling socks with UFOs, that says everything about how intense the saucer fever was.
It really does. So looking at all these hoaxes together, you see the motivations. Desire for attention, getting into journalism, local pranks, just capitalizing on the public interest, even commercial promotion. They're a significant proven part of the 1954 story.
Okay, so we have the outright hoaxes. But the report also covers cases that aren't necessarily proven fakes, but are still considered unreliable. Why?
Right. This is maybe the trickier category. These are cases where the evidence is just weak, or it's contradictory, or it seems heavily shaped by things like media stories, the witness's own background, or just memory fading and changing over time. It's less about deliberate lying, maybe more about the fuzziness of human experience and reporting.
Separating the signal from the noise, basically.
Exactly. That's the challenge here.
Let's look at case 5205 from Ponsiv, 1952. Witness Ferrari. Copper gold object, cylinders, rotating paddles, motor scooter sound, paralysis, strange words.
The analysis here points to major inconsistencies across different interviews with Ferrari over the years. Key details just kept changing.
Like what?
Well, were the dishes making up the object separate or merged? Were the beings standing on the rim or seen through windows? Even their size and color seemed to shift in different tellings.
So his story wasn't stable, it evolved. Why does the report think that happened?
It notes that the changes seem to mirror how UFO imagery itself was evolving globally in the media. Later versions of his story included details like maybe small green men or beings in domes that were becoming popular in the mid to late 50s but weren't in his earliest accounts.
Ah, so his memory might have gotten contaminated by other stories he heard later.
That's the strong suggestion. Either consciously or unconsciously, his recollections seem to absorb the circulating UFO folklore. There's also an odd detail about the sound, of low motor scooter sound. Seems way too quiet for a large metal craft maneuvering nearby.
Right, so later versions sound more like the standard UFO story that was developed.
That's the implication. The report considers a journalistic hoax or just a tall tale as highly likely, especially since Ferrari apparently asked for money for an official statement later on, which is often a red flag.
But his family said he was genuinely distressed initially.
They did, which complicates it. Misidentification of something mundane, a balloon, early helicopter is considered less likely given the detail, but not impossible. Ultimately, the inconsistencies and potential contamination lead the report to rate it highly unreliable. It shows how a potentially real, weird experience can get distorted over time.
It's tricky. Maybe he saw something upsetting, but how he remembered and retold it changed. What about case 5451, Erba, 1954? The weird figure and the vanishing soil samples.
Yes, witness Progina sees this strange figure near a hole in the ground with spreading discoloration. The report notes the figure's description sounds a bit like the Wheelman character from the Mandrake comics popular then.
Another potential pop culture influence.
Exactly, like Adamski figures or sci-fi tropes bleeding in. But the most frustrating part here is the physical trace evidence, or lack thereof.
What happened?
A hole was seen. Soil samples were supposedly taken by a local biologist who rushed to the scene, but this biologist, who is apparently known to be really into Martians and the paranormal, allegedly took all the evidence away. Everything.
He removed it all, so no one else could check it.
Correct. Journalists arriving later couldn't photograph the hole, couldn't get samples. Nothing was left for independent verification.
That sounds incredibly suspicious, either gross incompetence or something else. It destroys the credibility of the trace evidence claim.
Absolutely. The report notes the biologist's actions are highly problematic. Progina himself reportedly suffered physical and psychological effects, and the police confirmed his sanity, which argues against him just lying. But without the trace evidence and with the possible comic book influence, the report rates it as a likely hoax, or at least a highly embellished story where the physical part was compromised. The biologist's role is a huge question mark.
Okay, case 5453, Grosseto, 1954. Metallic suits, diver helmets, but conflicting descriptions.
This one really shows how even the immediate media reports during the 54 wave could be messy and unreliable. The analysis points out that different newspapers covering the same event gave wildly different descriptions of the entity.
How different?
One paper said short and wide with hairy head. Another said pot-bellied with sloped shoulders, ape-like arms, diving helmet head.
Those are completely different beings. So either the witnesses disagreed or the newspapers were just making things up or getting it wrong.
Precisely. Huge disparity. It suggests confusion, multiple witnesses seeing different things, or maybe just bad reporting and embellishment. There was no rigorous follow-up to clarify. Plus, the report notes some features, like the metallic suits and helmets, resemble details from the Abiet Guazon case, Case 5002, which had been publicized just a month before.
So maybe borrowing details from another recent famous case, narrative contagion in real time.
It looks like it. Because of the inconsistencies and lack of follow-up, it's rated unreliable. Shows we have to be critical even of reports published right after the event.
Case 5408, Casanovas, 1954. This one came out decades later.
Yeah, the witness statement was given over 20 years after the supposed event to a UFO group. Described a raindrop-shaped object, tall beings like 2 meters in light blue suits and goggles.
Doing what?
Collecting plant samples. Corn, specifically. Left cleanly cut stems and ground traces, apparently.
Tall beings harvesting corn. Sounds specific.
It is, but the report is skeptical. That level of detail recalled 2 decades later. Highly improbable due to memory decay. And the ground traces. Only the witness found them, much later. Not verified at the time. The details also didn't quite fit the typical 54 reports, which often had smaller beings. Evidentiary weight is very low, rated unsubstantiated.
The long delay is just killer for reliability. Okay, case 5443 near Venza, 1954. This one sounds like it has everything but the kitchen sink. Cigar object, small humanoids, diving suits, interest in rabbits, rifle failure, paralysis.
Yeah, the analysis strongly suspects narrative enhancement here, maybe invention, piling on so many dramatic elements: cigar ship, metallic divers, animal interest, rabbit theft pops up in folklore sometimes, useless weapon, paralysis. It feels less like one real event, more like a checklist of UFO tropes circulating them.
A bit too much drama for one encounter.
Possibly. The report suggests it reflects Cold War anxieties to advanced tech, helpless humans. It's rated unreliable, likely heavily embellished or fabricated, using bits from the broader UFO story pool.
Rabbit theft by aliens. Memorable, yes, but analytically suspicious.
Memorable, exactly. Lastly, case 5462 from Singoli, 1954. Child witnesses, shepherds, 12 years old.
What did they report?
A barrel-shaped object with vibrating antenna. And incredibly tiny beings, less than 40 centimeters tall, like under a foot and a half. Flat-topped heads, plastic-like suits, heard a hissing sound. Saw an explosive fireball when it took off, followed by strong wind.
Tiny beings, under 40 centimeter, vibrating antenna, explosive takeoff. Those details sound really specific and weird, not like the standard stuff.
They are, and the report acknowledges this. These features aren't typical of the common media tropes of 54. That makes it harder to dismiss as just imitation or misidentification of something common.
Were the kids questioned properly?
Relatively quickly, yes. By parents, a priest, the carabinieri. And they apparently stuck to the core weird details, especially about the tiny entities and the dramatic departure.
So potentially more intriguing.
Intriguing, yes, but it still suffers from a lack of critical follow-up. Later interviews were vague. An elderly woman who was supposedly also there was never traced or interviewed properly by investigators.
Ah. So a genuinely strange story, maybe less influenced by the usual narratives, but missing that crucial verification.
Exactly. The report rates it low likelihood for a simple, mundane explanation because of the bizarre details, but it equally lacks the solid evidence documentation, independent corroboration, traces to confirm an extraordinary event. It stays unreliable due to that evidence gap.
So across all these non-hoax but unreliable cases, we see the same problems recurring. Memory issues, media influence, potential misidentification filtered through UFO ideas, and just a lack of good, solid investigation at the time.
That's the overall picture. The report does mention mundane possibilities for some sightings. Meteors, balloons, unfamiliar aircraft like early helicopters, case 5438 for instance. But definitive proof, either way, is usually impossible decades later.
It seems like the signal of anything genuinely unknown, if it's there at all, is just buried under so much noise from culture, media, human error, and poor investigation.
That's a very accurate summary of the report's assessment for this whole period. A landscape of claims where the signal is incredibly hard, maybe impossible, to isolate from the noise.
Which brings us to the big one. The case the source seems to use as its main deep dive example, Sanina, case 5425, October 27, 1954, right in the middle of the wave.
Sanina is probably one of the most discussed, most documented early close encounters from Italy. Because it got immediate attention, was investigated relatively quickly by authorities and researchers, and the main witness, Rosa Lotti, was available for interviews over decades.
Although, as you said, that long-term availability brings its own issues with memory changing.
Exactly. It's a double-edged sword.
Okay, let's get the core story straight from the report. Who was Rosa Lotti, and what did she say happened?
Rosa Lotti was described as an illiterate peasant woman from near Sanina, a village in Tuscany. Her account is this. Just before dawn, October 27th, she's walking to church along a country path. She sees this strange object ahead of her on the path.
What kind of object?
She described it as looking somewhat like two cones joined at their bases, maybe spindle-shaped. And from this object, small humanoids emerged.
Small how? And what did they look like?
Under a meter tall, she said. But crucially, she didn't describe them as monsters or metallic robots. She said they looked human, well-proportioned, even very handsome, like little gentlemen dressed in strange, tight gray suits and leather helmets or caps.
Little gentlemen. That's really different from the usual little green man or gray alien tropes that were starting to circulate then.
Very different. And that's a key point the analysis picks up on. It's non-standard for the era's dominant narratives.
What are the interaction?
Also strange, almost.
Yeah.
Mundane or courteous in a way. They approached her calmly. They seemed interested in the things she was carrying, flowers for the church, and one of her stockings she had with her.
Interested in flowers and a stocking.
Apparently. She offered them some flowers and one of her stockings, and they took them, seemed pleased. They spoke, but in a language she couldn't understand, high-pitched, like birds, she said, repeating sound like liu, wee, lioi.
Okay.
And then they tried to give her something, a mysterious cylindrical object, like a roll or an ingot.
They tried to trade flowers and a stocking for a mysterious alien ingot. That sounds almost like something from folklore. A fairy encounter kind of interaction.
That's precisely the parallel the report's analysis draws. She was frightened, understandably, and refused the object. A later account from her husband mentioned a burst of compressed air as it left, but she never confirmed that detail herself. She said she glanced inside, saw a cramped space, small backless seats, like for kids.
How long did it last?
She estimated maybe 5 to 10 minutes. She felt they were calm, courteous, though one seemed nervous about being seen. When she walked away, she looked back, and they were still watching her.
And then what? How did the story get out?
She reached the village, visibly upset, pale, shaking, really frightened. She told friends, and she told the local priest, Don Enrico Rossi.
And the priest.
Here's where it gets immediately messy. According to early reports, the priest told her he thought they were beings from Mars, and he contacted the Carabinieri, the police.
Okay, so official involvement right away.
Yes. Warrant Officer Lully and Captain Massaro from the Carabinieri did visit Lotti later that same day and took her statement. That's significant rapid official attention. But the priest later publicly denied saying beings from Mars and denied being the one who called the police. He claimed someone else did.
So confusion or conflicting accounts right from the very first reporting step.
Exactly. Adds another layer of uncertainty to the historical record of how the information initially spread.
Okay, let's break down the evidence complexity like the report does, starting with the witness, Rosa Lottie herself.
Lottie was interviewed many, many times over 40-plus years. The report acknowledges her core stories stayed remarkably consistent. That's often seen as a point in favor of sincerity. However...
There's always a however.
Right. Later interviews show some detail accretion. She added nuances, maybe small elaborations, that weren't in the earliest press reports. This is common when people retell stories, especially if they're exposed to other similar narratives over time. It doesn't necessarily mean lying, but memory isn't a perfect recording.
And she was the only one who saw the beings in craft directly on the path.
Yes, the single observer for that core interaction. And remember, those first press accounts weren't direct quotes from her. They were filtered through her friend, the priest, the police. Potential for small changes or emphasis shifts right at the start.
Okay, what about immediate corroboration? Did anyone else see anything?
No one else saw the beings or the craft on the path with her, but several people, friends, the priest, parishioners, saw her arrive in the village right after, and they all confirmed her state.
Genuinely distressed, pale, trembling, frightened.
So that confirms she had a genuinely upsetting experience.
It confirms her reaction, yes. It strongly suggests something profound and disturbing happened to her, making it less likely she just casually made it all up. But it doesn't confirm what caused that reaction. It doesn't corroborate the beings or the craft.
A crucial distinction. Okay. Physical evidence. The outline mentioned a hole, burn marks. This sounds more solid.
This is maybe the most tantalizing, but ultimately the most frustrating part of Sanina. Multiple locals, the priest, Lottie's husband, a teacher, even a police officer interviewed years later, a child witness who went to the site, they all reported seeing a fresh conical hole right where Lottie said the object was.
A hole? What kind of hole? Descriptions varied slightly, but generally 10, 15 centimeters across, maybe 20 centimeters deep. Some also mentioned flattened ground nearby. Some reported burn marks or scorched grass. Some recalled a weird smell, like overheated brakes.
Okay, multiple people reporting a fresh hole and other marks at the site. That sounds like strong potential physical evidence. Suggests something physical was definitely there.
It sounds strong, but here's the massive weakness. The absolute analytical killer. Nobody took a photo, nobody took measurements, nobody collected a soil sample or a piece of that scorched grass. Despite police being involved that day,
Nothing. No documentation at all.
nothing preserved. The site was apparently swarmed by curious villagers very quickly. Any trace evidence was trampled, destroyed, obscured almost immediately, and people's memories of the details, exact size, burning, smell, diverged when asked later.
Oh, that is incredibly frustrating.
Yeah.
So we have reports of physical evidence, but no actual verifiable evidence itself.
Precisely. It remains tantalizing hearsay about traces, not documented proof. A huge missed opportunity for verification.
Okay. What about other sightings? Any corroborating aerial reports that day?
Yes, another intriguing layer. The report documents 4 or 5 independent sightings around the same time and general location. Different witnesses, people named Livy, Bertie, Valenti, some hunters, people in a religious procession reported seeing strange spindle-shaped or fiery objects in the sky.
Around Sanina on the same day?
Yeah.
That sounds potentially significant.
It definitely adds to the strangeness of that day in that area. Shows something unusual was being reported, but the report cautions against jumping to conclusions.
Aye.
The times weren't exactly the same, the directions varied, the shapes described weren't identical, so were they all seeing the same thing Lottie saw on the ground? Or different things? Meteors, planes misinterpreted, different unrelated phenomena? We can't know. They add context, suggest unusual activity, but don't directly corroborate Lottie's specific landing and interaction story.
Okay, so Sanina's evidence base is really complex and ambiguous. Sincere witness, maybe memory drift, corroboration of her distress, but not the cause. Reports of physical traces, but zero documentation. Nearby aerial sightings, but not clearly linked.
That sums it up well.
Now, what about that cultural context angle? The little gentleman, the folkloric interaction style. How does the report analyze that?
This is where the analysis gets really interesting, drawing those broader cultural connections. As we said, the beings Lottie described, small, human-like, well-dressed gentlemen, are not the typical 54 saucer occupants.
Right.
The report compares them to maybe 19th century fantasies about airship pilots, or even deeper to European fairy lore. Tales of meeting small, human-like beings in isolated places, especially woods or paths, often around dawn or dusk.
So maybe she interpreted a strange experience through a familiar folklore lens.
That's a key hypothesis the report explores. The interaction style fits too. The politeness, the smiling, the exchange of mundane items, flowers, stocking, the attempted gift. These echo pre-industrial folk tales about encounters with the little people or fairies involving trades or offerings.
And Rosa Lottie's background fits this.
Crucially, yes. Illiterate peasant woman, minimal exposure to sci-fi comics or sensational media at the time of the event. Proponents use this to argue against her imitating media tropes, but the report turns it around. Maybe her lack of modern frameworks meant she defaulted to the oldest available framework, rural folklore, to make sense of something genuinely strange she experienced.
Wow. That's a really compelling, if maybe unsettling way to think about it. A real strange stimulus interpreted through the language of folktales.
It's a strong possibility raised by the analysis,
Yeah.
and it leads into the competing models the report weighs for Sanina.
Okay, what are the main models?
One is this folklore framing idea we just discussed. Pre-dawn light, nerves, limited literacy, cultural background, maybe transforming something mundane, a surveyor's tripod, hunters, weird shadows, into this fantastical scene. The flower stocking exchange fits perfectly. The report rates this as plausible. Ouya 3 out of 5 stars.
What argues against that model?
The persistent, detailed description of the craft itself, the other aerial reports nearby, even if not directly linked, and the specific uniforms she described aren't easily explained by local activities or known folklore figures.
Okay, what's the second model?
An elaborate local prank. There were apparently rumors about a photographer and helpers being in the area. The object size, maybe around 1.7 meters tall based on some later analysis, though Lottie didn't confirm that size, could potentially be a manageable prop. The hole could be from a stake anchoring it. Taking the stocking could be a theatrical touch to make the story weirder.
How likely does the report find the prank idea?
Low likelihood. Low likelihood. 2 out of 5 stars. The main arguments against it are Lottie's very real, lasting distress confirmed by many people immediately after. And the reports of the hole from multiple witnesses, like the priest and policeman, seem inconsistent with just a simple stake hole from a quick prank. It feels like something more substantial might have been there.
And the third model, the big one.
Genuine non-human visitation. That Lottie really did have a close encounter, CE3, encounter with occupants, with non-human entities in their craft, and that the physical traces, if they'd been documented, would prove it.
The explanation UFO proponents would favor. How likely does the report rate this?
Acknowledging it's one of the strongest cases in the report overall, it still rates genuine visitation as low likelihood. 2 out of 5 stars. Same rating as the prank hypothesis.
Why so low, even for one of the best cases?
Because of the contradictions and ambiguities we've discussed, the slight evolution in Lottie's story over time, the non-standard details of the beings, which is weirdly both a point for and against authenticity, the almost mundane folkloric feel of the interaction, and crucially, the complete lack of definitive, verifiable evidence after 70 years. No smoking gun.
So even Sanina, probably the most deeply analyzed early Italian case, remains stuck in ambiguity. The report leans towards folklore framing or maybe an unconfirmed prank while admitting it's strange and the witness seems sincere. The lack of hard evidence is the ultimate barrier.
That's a fair summary of the report's nuanced conclusion on Sanina. It's a textbook example of the challenges. Memory, third-party filtering, undocumented traces, cultural influence, all muddying the waters. It remains debated because it's intriguing but ultimately unproven.
And the report mentions Lottie had other sightings after this became famous, and other people in the area too.
Yes. Glowing circles, red balls, which again just shows how a famous local story can potentially influence later perceptions and create a kind of feedback loop of sightings in that specific area.
Okay, let's pull back from Sanina and look at the big picture again.
Yeah.
Across all these cases, 1912 to 1954, what are the main takeaways, the patterns, the challenges that this source material highlights?
The clearest, loudest takeaway is that the vast majority of these documented cases, when critically analyzed by the report's author, are deemed unreliable.
Overwhelmingly unreliable.
Yes, for all the reasons we've hit on repeatedly.
Can you recap those main reasons?
Sure. It's usually late reporting, sometimes decades late, relying on just one witness or pure hearsay, major inconsistencies within the story itself as it's retold, or strong signs of being a deliberate hoax, a prank, or just heavily distorted by media coverage. The 1954 wave itself, while huge in terms of report volume, was massively amplified by the media frenzy. We saw how that led to narrative contagion, popular ideas, descriptions, tropes just getting copied and pasted, consciously or not, from one story to the next.
So the media wasn't just reporting, it was actively shaping the phenomenon itself, creating a kind of shared script for what encounters should look like.
Exactly. You get recurring themes. Humanoids, specific craft shapes, discs, cigars, sounds, paralysis, heat, claims of ground traces like holes or burns, even if those traces were rarely, if ever, properly documented.
But you also mentioned unique, bizarre details that don't fit the standard script.
Right? Eight-fingered beings, rabbit theft, old Latin conversations, those tiny 40-centimeter creatures. These outliers are weirdly fascinating, but make it harder to see a single consistent phenomenon. They resist easy categorization.
Which just underscores how vital source criticism is, like the report demonstrates.
Absolutely critical. You have to distinguish. What did the witness maybe say initially? What did the first newspaper report add or change? How did the story evolve in interviews years later, possibly soaking up other UFO lore? And which ones were just outright lies from the start? Understanding the source's journey is key. And while the dramatic cases are often unreliable, the report does suggest many simpler sightings from the period could have mundane explanations.
Like what?
Misidentified meteors, weather balloons, atmospheric effects, maybe unfamiliar aircraft in that post-war era early jets, helicopters that look strange to rural witnesses. Definitive proof is usually gone now, but mundane triggers remain statistically likely for many ambiguous reports.
And those tantalizing physical traces, Sanina's hole, Urba's soil samples, they remain just tantalizing reports.
Exactly. Intriguing claims, but without photos, measurement samples taken at the time and preserved properly, they're analytically useless today. Just stories about potential evidence, not evidence itself. A recurring dead end in historical cases.
So bringing it all together, what do all these stories, the reliable, the unreliable, the hoaxes, what do they represent? What does this deep dive teach us beyond just UFOs?
Well, they clearly represent a major cultural phenomenon. That 1954 wave especially was like a snapshot of Italy's collective mind in the post-war, early Cold War era, a time of anxiety, rapid technological change, looking to the skies.
So the sightings became a kind of mirror, reflecting society's hopes and fears.
I think that's a good way to put it. A canvas for projecting fears of the unknown, hopes for advanced saviors, anxieties about new technology. It's a window into the imagination of that specific time and place.
And it shows how stories themselves work, how they spread and change.
Absolutely. A powerful illustration of narrative formation, how an ambiguous event gets shaped by personal interpretation, by existing culture, folklore, sci-fi, massively amplified by media, and molded by our deep human need to make sense of the unexplained.
And a cautionary tale, too, about proving extraordinary claims.
A huge cautionary tale, especially about historical claims, where investigation standards were different or non-existent, and the very act of reporting could introduce huge distortions, and the sheer number of documented hoaxes.
Right, that shows a more deliberate side, how easily public fascination can be exploited.
Definitely. For attention, for money, for a joke, even for selling socks. The saucer fever made people credulous, and some took advantage. These cases prove it happened repeatedly.
You know, digging into all this historical material, seeing how easily stories got twisted or deliberately faked, how memory failed, how culture shaped perception back then, especially during that intense 54 wave, it really makes you think about today.
It absolutely does. It casts a long shadow or perhaps sheds light on our current situation.
So here's a thought to leave you with. Considering how easily stories could be embellished or invented even in the pre-digital age, and how media amplification fueled that narrative contagion during the 1954 UFO wave, what does the prevalence of hoaxes and unreliable accounts back then tell us about the information landscape we navigate today? An age where stories, claims, and potential fabrications spread infinitely faster and wider, making the challenge of distinguishing reality from distortion or outright invention perhaps even greater than ever before. Something to definitely ponder. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the strange, complex, and often elusive world of early Italian UFO landing reports, illuminated by this critical historical analysis.
Thank you. It was fascinating to explore.